Not everyone wants the biggest phone possible, so if you're looking for some compact iPhones, you have a couple of choices. The new updated 2022 iPhone SE or the iPhone 13 mini, and what I want to do is compare these two to see what you're actually missing for the $270 difference. And of course, I'm going to do a camera comparison to let you know if there's a big difference in image quality. First, let's talk about who these phones are for, and the iPhone SE is made for someone who doesn't care about the bells and whistles, maybe someone who still loves Touch ID, I know some people can't live without it, and it's for someone who's trying to buy a brand new iPhone at the cheapest price. It's the perfect first phone. The iPhone 13 mini is more for the person who wants the newer features like Face ID and wants more flagship features but in the smallest package possible. Unlike the iPhone SE, it has dual cameras, so while it's missing some features from the Pro lineup, it's still a very solid package. The reason why this comparison is even happening is because Apple decided to put the A15 Bionic in this year's iPhone SE, and if you don't know why that's a big deal, it's because it's the same processor powering the iPhone 13 lineup, including the Pros, so that's a lot of power to pack into a budget phone. In fact, this is probably the most powerful phone in its class, but what does that actually mean for the daily experience? First, let's take a look at the design side by side. Either you aren't going to mind the design of the iPhone SE dating back to the iPhone 8 with its rounded corners, the significant chin with Touch ID, and the forehead, or automatically you're going to favor the iPhone 13 mini with its boxy squared off edges, the thinner bezels, and the notch on the front for Face ID. Both of them are built very well, and even though that the iPhone SE has an older design, it still doesn't feel cheap at all. It's really thin compared to the iPhone 13 mini, and it does feel sleeker in the hand, but most people will just put a case on it anyway, so I'm not sure if that even matters anymore. It's surprising that overall the iPhone 13 mini is actually smaller than the iPhone SE, but both are very compact. The biggest difference to me in everyday use is the screen size. So the iPhone 13 mini has a larger 5.4-inch 1080p display, while the iPhone SE has a smaller 4.7-inch, slightly higher than 720p display. When you are watching something like a YouTube video, it doesn't seem like a huge difference at first until you fill the screen. It's a pretty big difference afterwards. And it's also sharper if you look with content, but to me it's more noticeable on the home screen and text. That's where I can see it the most. I do have to admit, as old as this panel is, it's actually not bad at all, and the screen is so small that things look pretty sharp on it, so if you're not a display snob, then this will definitely do. The iPhone 13 mini does have a better display overall though, even though that they're both 60Hz, everything looks smoother on the iPhone 13 mini, less ghosting, and that higher resolution is something that's definitely noticeable to me, but it just all depends on how much you care. They both have dual speaker systems, one at the bottom and one at the earpiece. I think that the iPhone 13 mini is a little bit louder and definitely richer, but here's an example, just listen for yourself. The new iPhone SE, despite being the cheapest iPhone, shares a lot of similarities with the iPhone 13 mini. Of course, it's got the same very powerful A15 Bionic chip, and they both also have 4GB of RAM, so performance is going to be very similar on both. They are both water resistant, even though that the iPhone 13 mini does have a higher rating. They are both good with everyday use. They both have wireless charging as well, which is nice, but the iPhone 13 mini does have built-in MagSafe for accessories while the SE does not, but you can add this actually with something like the Spigen case. It's pretty cool, and I will leave it linked in the description below. They both have 5G, which is fantastic. I'm surprised to see the Qualcomm X57 modem in the iPhone SE, and that does mid-band 5G, which is fine because that's what most people will use anyway. But remember that the iPhone 13 mini does have support for faster millimeter wave 5G, so if you have that super fast 5G in your area, that's definitely something that you need to consider. The thing that you need to think about in the price is the amount of storage that you get in the iPhone SE at $429. That only comes with 64GB of storage, which is a little too small in my opinion, but for $50 more you can get 128GB is where the iPhone 13 mini starts, so you get more base storage with the mini. The iPhone 13 mini being a little thicker does have its advantages too, because it gives it a bigger 2438 milliamp hour battery, where the iPhone SE does get a bigger battery this year at just over 2000 milliamp hours. So that bigger battery is going to give you better battery life, so that's something to keep in mind. But the iPhone SE, I can confirm, does have better battery life this year. But I am a power user, so I can't make it through the day with either one of these phones. But it all depends with battery life because everybody uses their phone differently. The last thing are the cameras. The big difference on the back is you get an ultra wide camera on the back of the 13 mini, where you have a single 12 megapixel camera on the back of the SE. The front facing cameras are different as well, but instead of talking about it, let's just jump straight into the images. When it comes to daytime pictures, the iPhone SE is very capable. The photos look fantastic and look very similar to the iPhone 13 mini, but there are some differences that you may see. First is the natural depth of field. The iPhone 13 mini has a bigger and newer sensor, as you can see here, so you get more bokeh or background separation without any special modes. I did notice some better dynamic range in certain situations, like this one. It's nothing crazy, but it's noticeable. I think the biggest thing is the ultra wide camera. This is something that you can't do with software, and this is something personally that I love having on my smartphones. Most main sensor shots are too close to really nitpick, but that ultra wide really gives a different perspective, so this is what you'd be missing out on the iPhone SE. But all this depends on if this is important to you, so if it's not, then don't worry about it. But sometimes you just need that ultra wide to get the full effect of something like this bridge. They both don't have zoom lens options, but they do have digital. Here's a side by side of the maximum digital zoom all the way up from here. The iPhone 13 mini is slightly sharper and more detail is picked up on the ground past the door. Having the A15 Bionic in the iPhone SE makes it a great camera for portrait mode. Both look fantastic in this one. I mean, if I had to be real, the iPhone SE sometimes takes the better portrait mode picture, which is really impressive. I prefer the tone on the SE here. But the downside is that you can't take portrait mode pictures of anything unless there is a face detected, which is a bummer, and that's not the case on the iPhone 13 mini, as you can see here. A lot of this is going to come down to personal preference with white balance and sharpness, but no one's going to be really looking at these side by side like this, so this is for informational purposes only. Just know that portrait mode is very legit on the iPhone SE, so you'll be very happy with that if you take pictures of your family and friends, just not objects. If I had to generalize, the daytime pictures, you will get a slightly brighter with a bump up in highlights on the iPhone 13 mini, and you can tell it's the newer camera system, but I'm very impressed with what Apple has been able to do with just software. This 12 megapixel camera has been around forever, so to be able to even compete with the iPhone 13 mini is very impressive. The front-facing camera on the iPhone SE is 7 megapixels, while the 13 mini has a 12 megapixel sensor, and during the day it's hard to tell a huge difference in image quality. The big thing for everyday use is that the iPhone 13 mini has a much wider sensor, so you can get so much more in the frame. On portrait mode, I did see that the iPhone 13 mini had better dynamic range. Take a look at the background, but the SE prioritized the exposure of my face more, so let me know which one that you like better. When it comes to video though, there is a pretty big difference, so here's an example of the front-facing video. This is an example from the front-facing camera, and you get 30 frames per second, 1080p on the iPhone SE, and look at the iPhone 13 mini, and the dynamic range off the bat looks so much better on the 13 mini. Oh, there it goes. Started to do something there, but yeah, there you go, 4K versus 1080p. The video on the iPhone SE during the day looks good. They both can shoot up to 4K 60 frames per second. And sorry about the choppiness of this video. I accidentally shot this in 4K 30 frames per second while the video timeline is in 24 frames per second. So that's why it looks like that. I didn't test cinematic video because it doesn't exist on the iPhone SE. So if you use that feature a lot, it's also something to consider. What I did want to test was the stabilization, since the iPhone 13 mini has the flagship sensor shift based stabilization, and it does make a difference. It keeps the video more stable. But the iPhone SE is not doing bad whatsoever, so during the day, it's a great camera system. At night is where you're going to see some of the drawbacks. In moderate low light, the SE doesn't do bad at all, but unfortunately there is no night mode, so with it enabled, you can see that the iPhone 13 mini shot is much better all around. Now, there is a way to get night mode through third-party apps, so it's not that the iPhone SE is not capable, and sometimes through apps like NeuralCam, you can get great results like this. But most of the time I was getting noisy pictures, and that's probably a limitation of the sensor, and third-party apps don't optimize for things like this. So that's my biggest wish list for the SE, is to gain night mode through a software update. Take a look at this shot when I was going through Remy's Ratatouille adventure. You can tell without punching in that it's softer all around, but when you punch into the textures, you can clearly see the difference here in detail. It's a major difference. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that the iPhone SE is terrible. As you can see here, it's just that the iPhone 13 mini will give you brighter and much more detailed image, and you also have that flexibility of the ultra wide camera too at night, so that's something to keep in mind. Sometimes I do like the heavier contrast approach of the iPhone SE, like in this scenario, but you can see more shadow detail on the 13 mini, and then when you punch into the ground detail, look at the difference. So again, if you take a lot of nighttime photos, the 13 mini is the way to go. But if you rarely shoot pictures at night and you're primarily a daytime shooter, then the iPhone SE is going to be just fine. As you can see, it does a good job in moderate lighting. Since the processor can handle it, I would love to see native night mode support, so I hope that happens in the future. If you're looking to shoot a lot of 4K video at night, it's the same story. You can see that the iPhone 13 mini produces the brighter video. The tree is visible here on the mini where you can't see it at all on the SE, and that's because the SE is using contrast to decrease the noise, which is fine because it's totally usable video. If you've ever been here into this section of Epcot, it's really dark, so it's impressive that the iPhone SE's video is shareable. In more mixed lighting, when looking at it on a smaller screen, it's going to be hard to tell the difference, but if you do peep, the SE's video is noisier, and both of them have similar lens reflections, but considering the price of the SE, this is better than I thought it would be. What do you think? Were you surprised? Now that you have all of that information, which one would you pick? Is the iPhone 13 mini worth the extra $270? I personally like the more updated design and the features of the iPhone 13 mini, but it all depends on your needs and of course your budget. But this thing packs a lot of power, and I'm glad that it exists, and I think it's going to make a lot of people happy. And even if you're not happy with the $429 price tag, like tech always does, it goes on sale. So when it does, you scoop this thing up because this thing is very powerful and very capable. I'm looking forward to the future of the iPhone SE line because I think we really do need a design change, but this thing is still very solid.